July 23rd, Saturday of the 16th week in Ordinary Time. When I started at Holy Cross more than 20 years ago, I and the college were attacked because we had a support group for gay students. It wasn't even an advocacy organization. It was just committed to providing acceptance and support to students who were struggling with sexual identity and were often subject to harassment and rejection because of it. We were accused of being unfaithful, immoral, and disloyal to the church and its teachings for allowing such a group to exist. Even back then, the attack seemed like an unjustified overreaction to a humane and compassionate response to an obvious need, and one that was consistent with church teaching. Nevertheless, the language used was very harsh and emotional. Of course, it can cut both ways. Today, anyone who tries to defend a traditional view of marriage is immediately branded as a bigot and a hater. We face many issues in our society and in the church that, while they may be governed by clear moral principles, are much more complex and difficult to judge in practice because they involve competing moral demands and have widespread and unpredictable consequences. These include issues of public health, such as vaccines and quarantines, reparations for past injustices, adjudication of accusations of abuse and harassment, immigration, foreign alliances and trade, gun ownership, taxes and benefits, the environment, and many other controversial issues. These often pit the legitimate interests and claims of one group against those of another. In the sphere of public policy and legislation, a reasonably fair and viable response requires thoughtful analysis, debate, and compromise to find a solution that takes into account all the relevant concerns and is acceptable or at least tolerable to all parties. A well-functioning democracy has to be able to do that. We don't seem to be doing very well on that score these days. Too often, what should be a thoughtful and informed debate devolves into a screaming match. That is not unique to our era. One need only think back to the late 60s and early 70s, when the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and calls for greater economic justice were tearing the country apart. The problem at such times is that people absolutize their own positions and therefore assume that anyone who disagrees with them must be evil and stupid. For example, if you advocate for more aggressive government policies to help poor and working class people, you will be branded as a commie out to destroy our country and our way of life. If, on the other hand, you argue that it is individual initiative and the free market that is most effective in lifting people out of poverty, then you will be accused of being a greedy capitalist, enriching yourself by preying on the poor and powerless. There are problems with such a rigid, judgmental attitude. First of all, it's unfair. It is possible for reasonable people of goodwill to hold different positions on these issues, depending on their backgrounds, their experiences, their loyalties, and the values they hold most dear. To dismiss someone as evil because they disagree with you on an important issue is to miss the good in them and to not deny them the dignity and respect they deserve. It's also arrogant and self-serving. Even more important, it does not leave room for the empathy and understanding necessary for any kind of constructive dialogue that can help a community work toward a realistic solution to a difficult moral issue. A public policy on a controversial issue almost always requires compromise if it is to have the broad support it must have to be effective. But you don't compromise with the devil. There has to be mutual respect and trust, which requires an assumption of goodwill in one's opponents and a willingness to listen and learn from them. That is why Jesus' admonition in today's gospel is so important. Don't take it on yourself to destroy all the bad stuff you see in others, he tells his disciples. It is too closely tied with the good, and you can't always tell which is which. If you try to destroy what you think is bad, you will probably do great harm to the good. Note that Jesus does not deny that there are lots of weeds out there that ultimately need to be cleaned up. There is a mixture of good and evil in all of us. Jesus assures us that there will be a final reckoning where the good is brought to fulfillment and the evil destroyed. God's tolerance is not an invitation to selfishness and lax behavior. Going that way will lead to our own destruction and great harm to others. This point is reinforced in the first reading, where the prophet Jeremiah warns against presumption. Just because they claim to be religious, the people will not be protected from dire consequences if they practice injustice and take advantage of the weak and the vulnerable. We need to pay attention to our own behavior and make sure we live according to God's law of justice and mercy. We should leave the judgment of others to God, who alone sees what is in the heart.